channel info as soon as I figure it out. It depends on how work stuff goes tomorrow. So anyways, in regards to the patch, let me first link something that I talked about earlier at the very start of the stream, which is this. And so this was basically what Wargaming said in the patch notes. This is one of the most significant updates we've ever introduced in the game, both in terms of importance of the issues it tackles and the sheer scope of fundamental changes it simultaneously introduces. And so my entire take of this, even, you know, before the 9.18 made it to common test, my feeling was, wow, they're trying to pack a lot in here. So hopefully this will, you know, this is probably going to take some time on test for them to sort it out. You'll think back to when the Swedish tanks came out, and they were basically working on two things: one, introducing the Swedish tanks, and two, making some overhauls to the overmatch mechanics. And that patch went through several iterations on test, and then ultimately they didn't even come out with the overmatch changes because they weren't really happy with it. Now, the reason why I bring that up is that 9.18 by comparison feels very rushed. And I think that it says a lot that it's being released to the NA server, but not anyplace else. And I don't necessarily think that that's a good thing. I think that basically what they're trying to do is figure out these things on the fly that could potentially be figured out on common test. Now, there's 4 significant changes that we're talking about here, or 4 changes that we're talking about. Some of them aren't really that significant. Now, we'll look at them in no specific order, but the first change is the basically reusable consumables, where consumables basically now have a cooldown, which allows you to reuse them during battle. So it's not like one fire and you're out sort of thing, unless you get them really close in succession. Now, I don't have a problem with that. I think that that's fine. And from the beginning, I said as long as the cooldown isn't like stupidly short, you'll probably be fine. Like, there's no issue with having, in my opinion, cooldowns of 90 seconds on your consumables. So to me, that's a non-issue. I don't think that takes a whole lot of beta testing in order for you to figure that out, whether that cooldown is appropriate or not. And I think 90 seconds is a good number. Like, I would have been fine with 2 minutes as well. When it starts getting down to 60 seconds, we're like, I don't know, I guess, maybe. And if it was any lower than that, then I think you would start seeing more issues. Now, keep in mind that most games run, let's say, 6 to 8 minutes, somewhere in that range. So it's not like you're sitting there repairing each of your ammo rack and then your gun and then it's not like you can just repair everything all at once. And so there's still decisions to be made in terms of, oh, if I get my ammo rack and my tracks damaged at the same time and I'm tracked out in the open, right? Before, it was like, okay, let me think, let me do the math. Can I survive being tracked out here until I can pull back, or am I going to get killed? Because otherwise I'd rather fix my ammo rack. Now it's a little bit, the math is a little bit more in your favor, where you're just like, okay, I'm going to fix the track now, and we'll get to the ammo rack when we get to it. We'll be gimped for a while, but the math that you do becomes a little different. But I actually think that that's a good thing. I think that it's good that you have that option. Now, that being said, that's the most minor change in here. And so the other big change, or another big change, is when you look at the premium, the matchmaking. And so basically they changed the ways that the matchmaking can work. And as I was saying earlier in the stream, when you look at what did they actually do on common tests, they basically released all of these things onto common tests, and then they did a micro patch. Now, the only thing that the micro patch addressed was the light tank balance, right? It didn't address anything in matchmaking. It didn't address anything with the consumables. It didn't address anything, was the fourth thing that we're missing here, with artillery, right? It didn't address any of those things. And so basically matchmaking has gone in as advertised, so to speak. And what I've said from the very beginning is that if you are good players and you are willing to platoon in tier 10 games, I think that gives you an advantage in X percentage of your games, because there's certain games where there will be a limited number of top tiers that you're going to be in. And yes, you're going to be more likely to be matched up against another platoon, but that doesn't matter if you're good players, right? And so I think that that's certainly to the advantage if you are willing and or able to bully or play tanks that can bully, because there's going to be a lot more bottom levels to feed on. And so I think that that's potentially a limitation of the matchmaking, but I can concede the argument of Wargaming for moving the matchmaking onto the live server, as we didn't feel that we were getting an appropriate number and types of tiers on the common test to appropriately test the matchmaking of the matchmaking changes. I get that. I'm down with that. Okay, so we covered two things. One, consumables, I'm fine with. I don't see that that's a problem at all. To me, it's almost a no-brainer in the sense like giving everybody 6 cents. Like if you gave everybody 6 cents, I don't really think that you need to run that through test per se. Unless it's like completely bugging everything else out or something. You know what I mean. Like that's not something that requires like, oh, we got to make sure that this is balanced. So the consumable things, cool with. Matchmaking, I'm cool with matchmaking moving on to the live servers under the argument that we weren't getting the numbers that we should have in order to appropriately test that. So I'm fine with that. Now let's look at the two other things. One, we'll look at the light tanks first. Now the light tanks are an interesting case, and this is what I was talking about even before the patch came out, which is what is the role for these light tanks going to be? Are they going to have a role, or are they just going to be crappy mediums? And so essentially, especially once the guns got nerfed, when you look at the physical characteristics of these tanks, the tier 10 light tanks, and I basically will talk about the tier 10 ones because those are the ones that we're really comparing when we talk about endgame. As I said earlier, the tier 9 light tanks actually seem somewhat competitive, but the tier 10 light tanks, to me, just at a glance, I haven't played them yet, but to me it seems like they're going to be a little bit underwhelming, particularly if you try to play them as mediums. And if you go back to yesterday's stream, I talked about basically the margin that you have to work in, because if you are a light tank using your camo and sort of not using your gun unless it's completely safe to do so, and I think that a lot of people are going to end up playing their tier 10 light tanks as medium tanks, and they're going to suffer because of it. And it's just like, bruh, if you had just gotten into a medium tank instead of a light tank and done the exact same thing that you were doing, you would have been effective. But that's, I think, going to be ultimately the limitation at tier 10. I don't see that as much of an issue with the lower tiers, particularly if you get into a lower tier light tank in a higher tier match. Then it becomes a little bit more like what we had seen previously, although I'm not still entirely convinced that the upper tiers of the light tanks are going to be as effective as they were in a sense, even though they were essentially up tiered before. And so I think that's a major limitations of the light tanks, but I don't really feel like you can convince me that what you just did in a light tank, you could not have done better in a medium tank of the same tier. And that's a concern, because then it goes back to that question that I was talking about initially, which is, what is the role of the light tank? I mean, is it just to be a crappier version of the medium tanks if they don't really have better view range? You've got better camo, but again, as I was saying, that margin that you have to work with for the camo, because a lot of those medium tanks, they have competitive camo, right? Even on the move, right? Yesterday we did the Bat Chat as a comparison, and the Bat Chat is a little bit funky because the Bat Chat is a pretty good scouting tank, but it is not unreasonable that a Bat Chat would be matched up against a tier 10 light tank in the sense of, oh, they're both trying to scout the same area. And so it's not unreasonable that the Bat Chat can be outspotted by the light tank, but only outspotted by the light tank by, let's say, 30 meters. Right? And so I think that's a problem, because if you've only got 30 meters within to work with, you got to be really on the point with your positioning. And I think that's difficult on a lot of maps. And so that's why I think that light tanks will end up not really quite having a role, particularly in pub matches. As I said yesterday, I think there might be some role for them in specialty situations, like a more organized play. I was talking about using them as your surfing scout on Prokhorovka, or your ridge scout on Malinovka, things like that. Like there's some specialty areas where yes, a light tank can outplay the medium tank, but by and large, my feeling is that anything that you do in a pub, if you look across a number of pub matches, you could have already done better in a medium tank. So I think that's potentially an issue. Again, as I was saying previously, I don't know exactly how you address that other than let's test bringing down the view range of all the medium tanks. But this is one of those examples. So I said I'm fine with the consumables. I said I'm fine with the matchmaking. I don't necessarily agree with just throwing the matchmaking out there, but I get the argument that we needed more numbers. Now, what I don't agree with is pushing out the light tanks in their current form, because I don't feel that they're competitive, and I think that that's an issue. I think you need to work harder on finding the niche. And same thing when we look back to the last patch we were talking about when the Swedish tanks came out, right? They held back the overmatch because they didn't really feel like the overmatch was working properly. It was messing up too many things there was too much collateral damage. Not essentially unforeseen consequences, but some certain other tanks that weren't Swedish were getting too big of quote unquote buffs, and so they ended up holding it back. And it really feels like they probably should have done that with the light tanks as well, again, because I don't really feel like the tier 10s are going to be competitive. And then so now when we look at the final thing where we go to artillery, and again, artillery was another aspect that was not changed at all on test. So any data that we got from test, they were just like, presumably they were like, oh, it looks fine, all right, let's just throw it on live. And to me, that feels a little bit premature. I think that people are hungry for a change for artillery. I'm not entirely certain that a debuff mechanism is the right way to go. Again, we've talked about this many times, but I've always felt that the best thing to do would be to go more the direction of what Armored Warfare already did. And why there's resistance to that, I had several theories on it, but I won't really go over that now. Basically what I felt should have been done is, and this is not like an original idea of mine, this is something that's been talked about on the forums for years, is that, well, if you just reduce the alpha and increase the fire rate accordingly, problem solved, right? And I don't necessarily feel like they did that. I mean, in a sense, they did that because they did reduce the alpha and they did increase the fire rate, but they also added this debuff mechanic. And I think that it's going to have the potential to be more annoying than it's going to be more annoying for the people who get shot than it is rewarding for the people who are doing the shooting. And that's something that I made an argument about yesterday. But again, I haven't played the arty mechanic that much. I haven't really seen it that much. I've been debuffed a couple of times. Again, I think a lot of it depends on the map and the position that you're in. I understand from a strategic point, if we're talking about organized games, that is potentially useful, but to me, like the debuff mechanic, so I don't know if some of you guys have played Strongholds and things like that, but basically in Strongholds you can get essentially consumables where you can call in airstrikes on certain areas. And like, to me, if you did that and you had a debuff, then there's some strategic value to that. So if you're playing Clan Wars or Tournament Player or whatever, you can call that in on a push so that people are debuffed as you go in. Of course, there's also that counter as well. But again, at least to me, that makes some strategic sense. When you're talking about pub matches, I'm not necessarily seeing the debuff mechanic as being part of a coordinated effort of your team to win in a specific area. Now, again, as I was saying, I don't necessarily feel that was I don't feel necessarily that it's a bad idea what they've done. I just feel that they're overcomplicating a very simple issue. And I think that introduces variables. And when you introduce variables, you got to be able to test them. And so, to me, it really feels like if they wanted to move this patch forward today, what they should have done is they should have moved matchmaking forward and just said, hey, we need more numbers to see whether this is working out for us. Whether, does it favor, high tier platoons? Does it favor this? Does it favor that? Right? And also, moving the consumables forward was fine. But I really feel like they should have held back on the light tanks, and I really feel like they should have held back on the arty mechanics until they got more feedback. Because both of those seem rushed to me. And that's why I was saying the moral of the story is twofold. One, that if I were just to look at it in a vacuum, it feels rushed. If I were to look at it not just as the patch that was put onto the NA today, but that the patch is only to the NA servers, right? There's no intent to move this patch to any of the other servers. Then it becomes even more obvious that, yeah, we don't think that this patch is really ready for prime time, but we kind of want to see what people think. And it's like, to me, that's, I don't know that that's the best way to go about things. I can't get behind the argument. And again, I don't know what their logic is. You know, maybe they've looked at the numbers really closely and they're like, oh, we need to do this. But if that was true, then I don't know. I mean, I haven't heard the argument that's convincing that says, okay, well, this is a good idea to move this patch in its current state out. And as I was saying, you know, before, when the patch first hit test, I was like, oh, this is going to take several iterations to get right, because this is not going to be something that they're just going to be able to put in and get right the first time. And again, 3 out of 4 things that they changed in this patch, they made 0 changes to on common test. And to me, that feels like a dice roll. So that's my basic thoughts on the patch. And again, I'm not being a negative Nilly and saying, oh man, this patch is awful. I'm merely saying that it feels rushed. I'm not entirely sure that the mechanics, particularly the light tank mechanics and the artillery mechanics, are really well polished, or even roughly polished. And I think that is problems for anybody who plays artillery or against artillery or as a light tank. As far as I can tell, the consumable mechanic, as I sort of anticipated, seems fine to me. As long as the cooldown is not too low, that's fine. No biggie. The matchmaking, I think that's a little bit more difficult. And again, as I was saying earlier, I understand. I get that. I get the argument for that. And it'll be interesting to see, particularly with skilled players, if you platoon high-tier platoons, then what happens.